In Mark 14:62, Jesus said, "You will see the Son of Man seated at the right hand of power and coming with the clouds of heaven." And then in Matthew 24:34, Jesus said, "This generation will not pass away until all these things take place." Now, when Jesus said these things to the original audience, was he talking about the end of the world? Was he referring to his second coming when he comes back in the future? Or was he referring to something else entirely? Today, we're going to look at a view that is less common among Christian circles, but that I think provides a reasonable explanation for these predictions by Jesus. And hopefully, this will at least give you another view for you to research and ponder as you wrestle with these questions. Specifically, the question of, did Jesus predict the end of the world or something else? Before we look at the New Testament context of this complex issue, let's first look at the key passage for this view, which is in Daniel 7, which says, "I saw in the night visions, and behold, with the clouds of heaven there came one like a son of man, and he came to the Ancient of Days and was presented before him. And to him was given dominion and glory and a kingdom, that all peoples, nations, and languages should serve him. His dominion is an everlasting dominion, which shall not pass away, and his kingdom one that shall not be destroyed." This passage speaks of the Son of Man, which is a figure that Jesus often uses to refer to himself, and is in the passage we looked at earlier in Mark chapter 14. So this passage is connected to what Jesus says in the Gospels about himself as the Son of Man. There are two interpretations that are often cited for these passages. First is the common view, which says that when the Son of Man is coming on the clouds, that movement is from heaven and towards earth. In other words, this is talking about Jesus returning to earth during his second coming in the future. However, a prominent New Testament scholar, N.T. Wright, has a different view, where he says the movement is actually towards God and not towards earth. In other words, the Son of Man coming on the clouds is not Jesus coming from heaven down to earth, but is Jesus coming from earth and going to heaven. And this is seen when Jesus is enthroned in heaven during his ascension after his death and resurrection. When we look at Daniel 7, it clearly is saying that the Son of Man is being presented before God. So in other words, God is in heaven and the Son of Man is coming before God. It also says that the Son of Man here receives authority and the kingdom from the Ancient of Days. This movement is upward towards the Ancient of Days, not downward towards the earth. And in order to understand this perspective better, we first must look at the Old Testament context, specifically for the phrase coming on the clouds. One of the most prominent passages that speaks on coming on the clouds in the Old Testament is in Isaiah 19, which says, "An oracle concerning Egypt. Behold, the Lord is riding on a swift cloud and comes to Egypt, and the idols of Egypt will tremble at his presence, and the heart of the Egyptians will melt within them." In other words, this language of the Lord riding on a cloud and coming to a nation symbolizes God's divine authority. It also symbolizes the heavenly enthronement, that God is king even over Egypt. And then lastly, this idea of judgment through history. In other words, God is saying that he's going to come and judge the Egyptians. And this riding on the cloud language is symbolic of that act in history. To summarize so far, this view says that the coming of the Son of Man in Daniel 7 and in the Gospels is about Jesus going up to be enthroned in heaven, not coming down to earth at the end of time. And this idea of the coming of the Son of Man is seen in two events in the first century. The first event referring to the Son of Man is the ascension of Jesus. And as we looked at the passage earlier, it says, "You will see the Son of Man seated at the right hand of power and coming with the clouds of heaven." And the reason why scholars like N.T. Wright think Jesus here is referencing Daniel 7 and the Son of Man passage is because after Jesus' suffering and death on the cross, he is vindicated not only by his resurrection, but also by his ascension to the right hand of the Father. And secondly, the Son of Man being seated at the right hand of power refers to Jesus' enthronement as king, because now he is at the right hand and ruling. Also, there are other places in the New Testament that confirm this idea of Jesus' enthronement. In Acts 1:9, speaking of Jesus, it says, "And when he had said these things, as they were looking on, he was lifted up, and a cloud took him out of their sight." And then in Ephesians 1, he raised him from the dead and seated him at his right hand in the heavenly places, far above all rule and authority and power and dominion, and above every name that is named, not only in this age, but also in the one to come. Now that we have more background and context on the idea of the Son of Man and coming on the clouds, let's now look at the Olivet Discourse, primarily in Matthew chapter 24. So first, Jesus has a prediction. He says, "Truly I say to you, there will not be left here one stone upon another that will not be thrown down." Then the disciples ask, "Tell us, when will these things be, and what will be the sign of your coming and of the end of the age?" What the disciples were really asking is, when will the temple be destroyed? And what will be the sign that this is happening? So Jesus is referencing the temple and says that it will be destroyed. Hence, one stone will not be upon another. And the disciples are asking, what is the sign that this will happen so that we can be expecting it and be ready for it? So the context of the Olivet Discourse is all about when will the temple be destroyed? And once we understand that, then this view will make a lot more sense. According to Jesus in the Olivet Discourse, there are at least 4 signs that the temple is about to be destroyed. First, there will be wars and rumors of wars. Second, believers in Jesus will be persecuted for their faith and even be put to death. Third, the abomination of desolation will take place, which we'll speak about in a moment. And then fourth, Jerusalem will be surrounded. This is most clearly articulated by Jesus in Luke's version of the Olivet Discourse, where he says, "When you see Jerusalem surrounded by armies, then know that its desolation has come near." Then, after Jesus says all of these signs, he says in Matthew 24:34, "This generation will not pass away until all these things take place." So now we turn to the second event, which happened in AD 70, which is the destruction of the temple. So let's look at a brief timeline of the events. In 66 AD, the first Jewish-Roman war began. Then the Roman armies lay siege to Jerusalem. After this, Roman and pagan idols are brought near the temple area. And then lastly, the second temple in Jerusalem is burned to the ground by the Romans. This brings us to the idea of the abomination of desolation. So abomination often refers to something that is idolatrous or against God, and desolation has the idea of destruction being brought to the temple. The abomination of desolation is when the Romans brought in pagan idols and destroyed the temple by burning it to the ground. This event symbolizes that the entire Old Covenant sacrificial system has come to an end. In summary, the fall of Jerusalem and the destruction of the temple in 70 AD shows that Jesus has been enthroned, and it also points to the fact that Jesus is now ruling as king. And lastly, the destruction of the temple is evidence that the temple system has now ended and that we are no longer under the Old Covenant. In summary of this view, the 2 events that point to the Son of Man coming on the clouds are the ascension, where Jesus is crowned king in heaven, and then the destruction of the temple, where the world sees the consequences of Jesus' kingship on the earth, and where the temple system in the Old Testament is brought to an end. Another way to help understand this view better is to look at the order of events in chronological order. So first you have Jesus being crucified and raised from the dead. Then Jesus ascends into heaven and is enthroned as king. Once again, this points back to Daniel 7, where Jesus as the Son of Man is presented before the Ancient of Days and receives the kingdom. Then the gospel spreads, so the message of this enthroned king goes out to all nations. Then eventually the Jewish-Roman war begins, which sets the stage for Jesus' prophecy in the Olivet Discourse. And then lastly, the temple falls, which again serves as a visible confirmation that Jesus is king and that the Old Covenant age has ended. Hopefully now at least this view makes more sense to you. However, you might be wondering, what about the future? Does this mean that Jesus is not coming back again or something else? At this point, it's helpful to look at three things this interpretation does not deny. It does not deny the future return of Jesus, the bodily resurrection, or the final judgment. All three of these events are still on the table and are future events still to come. However, this interpretation does separate two things. First, the past from 30 to 70 AD with the ascension and the destruction of the temple, which is portrayed in Daniel 7 and the Olivet Discourse by Jesus, and the future, which are the events still to come, including the final return of Christ. The goal of this video is just to offer an alternative view about the Son of Man and coming on the clouds. And I hope this video will spur you on to further investigation and to read more about this view. With that said, to me, the applications of this view are quite strong. If we were to take this view, then the New Testament would be more about the shift from the Old Covenant to the New Covenant. It would be more about Jesus becoming king. And finally, instead of having a fear about the future and things to come, this view inspires confidence that Jesus is now ruling as king and that we can accept and trust his authority in our lives.